Hey folks, in today's episode, I'm going to be reviewing the final chapter in the zine I put together called Psychology, the Science of the Soul. And this is the shortest chapter in the publication. And its topic is Rediscovering the Sacred. That's what it's titled. And here we're going to be covering some material that we already covered in a few of the previous videos, in particularly in the video Modern Man in Search of a Myth. But the main idea here is that we need to move beyond the paradigm of scientific materialism. And we need to do this by re-ensouling science, meaning we need to connect science back with religion. And the mechanism that we need to do this is to reintegrate both with philosophy, meaning we need to reclaim philosophy from this position of insignificance and irrelevance that it's currently in. And we need to place it back on the foundations by which it was originated by the Pythagoreans and by the Buddhist sects and the Taoists and the various great philosophical sects of antiquity who gave us the disciplines of philosophy. And we need to move away from this babble of confusion that philosophy is currently set in. And if we can do that, then we can find a way to take a new approach to the philosophy of science and to understand that so much of what we consider science is actually a type of scientific dogmatism. And we can also understand the shortcomings of the previous eras of religious dogmatism that the world is still in the grips of, but which especially dominated the pre-scientific age. So we can move beyond dogmatism completely, and in so doing we can re-ensoul science, and we can bring religion into a modern context by which it is informed by scientific ideas and doesn't see itself in competition with them. And again, I think that philosophy is the vehicle by which this triumvirate can be established once again. And in this way, we have the tools. By using all three of these elements, we have the tools to build a modern myth that we'll need to use to resurrect this civilization, this dying civilization pattern that we're in. And so I'm going to kick things off with this overview of this chapter by re-emphasizing Stan Grof's concept of the cosmic game. Now, I did a whole video and a lecture of his called The Cosmic Game. So this is just going to be like a concise summary of the basic spiritual reality that he comes away with after his decades-long work in consciousness research. And so in his book, The Cosmic Game, Stan Grof describes the nature of reality, this ensouled world that we actually live in. He describes it in the following way. The world we inhabit is really an infinitely sophisticated, quote, virtual reality, a divine play created by absolute consciousness. Our universe that appears to contain countless myriads of separate entities and elements is, in its deepest nature, just one being of immense proportions and unimaginable complexity. According to this view, creation is an intricate, infinitely complex cosmic game that the Godhead, Brahman, creates from himself and within himself. He is the playwright who also conceived the game, as well as its producer, director, and also all the actors who play the countless myriad roles involved. This cosmic game of games is played in many dimensions, on many levels, and on unimaginable scales. The divine creator does not create something outside of itself, but instead undergoes transformations within the field of its own being. These transformations involve complicated sequences of divisions, fragmentations, and differentiations. This finally results in experiential worlds that contain countless separate entities that are endowed with specific forms of consciousness and possess selective self-awareness. By implication, these separate units of consciousness, in spite of their individuality and specific differences, remain on another level, their most true level, essentially identical with their source and with each other. So this is the concept of the cosmic game, which is the idea that creation is taking within the divine being by the divine being and for the ultimate purposes of that divine being. And so that we are all instruments of this creative activity that's taking place within the divine being, that we're never separated from this spiritual over-souling concept. Now, I want to point out a quote from Richard Tarnas from his book, The Passion of the Western Mind, where he gives another take on this. And this writing here is based around the work of Hegel. And Hegel was, I think he was 18th century. So in this quote, we're going to be looking at the spiritual underpinnings of human history. So quoting Tarnas, in Hegel's conception, both nature and history are ever progressing toward the absolute. The world is the history of the divine's unfolding, a constant process of becoming, an immense drama in which the universe reveals itself to itself and achieves its freedom. According to this view, which was inspired by Hermeticism, meaning Hegel was a student of the Hermetic teachings, the entire history of man's evolution in nature is the story of deity evolving its own consciousness within a universe that is its own creation. The main idea is that deity creates the framework of the universe and then submerges itself within its creation in order to undergo a self-imposed experience of separation, ignorance, and isolation, which then facilitates a further experience of spiritual reawakening, reintegration, and liberation. The upshot of this is that by undergoing this self-willed cycle of experience, deity catalyzes its own mysterious process of evolution and growth. So, again, the deity is the universal life, the one consciousness that all things take place within. And so the universal mind even is a product of and takes place within this universal consciousness. And so the universal mind is the fashioner of this meditation, this great divine meditation that's taking place within consciousness and by consciousness. So in this way, we should understand that consciousness is spirit. They're equivalent terms in the way I'm using the term consciousness as this ultimate factor. It's equivalent to the way the ancients talked about spirit. Now, I have another quote here. This is from Manly P. Hall, in which these ideas are also expressed. Mr. Hall writes, "The universe is the larger body of God, and man himself is the smaller, but equally wonderful habitation of the divine being. Man becomes godlike by revealing his own participation in the substance of God. Thus, by releasing his own divine potential and permitting this to flow outward through his parts and members, man becomes a living witness to and a revelation of the sovereign spirit of life." So this quote here emphasizes the same aspect of the cosmic game, but it's emphasizing that man has a unique role to play in this creation. The human kingdom is a specific instrument intended for a specific purpose. And so part of the awakening that we need to have, the rediscovering the sacred and a re-enchanting of the cosmos, is to understand not only that all this is taking place within a spiritual reality for a divine purpose, but also that man has a unique role to play. And by implication, each of us as individuals has a unique role to play. So there is a meaning and purpose behind our individual existences, just as there is a meaning and purpose to mankind's existence within nature. That the universe is inherently purposeful. It's taking place as a deliberate meditation within the being of God, meaning within this divine consciousness. So on that note, I have another quote of Stan Grof's from The Cosmic Game. He writes, "Existence is a fantastical, experiential adventure of absolute consciousness, an endless cosmic dance, exquisite play, or divine drama. In producing it, the creative principle generates from itself and within itself a countless number of individual images, split units of consciousness, that assume various degrees of relative autonomy and independence. Each of them represents an opportunity for a unique experience. It is therefore necessary to assume that the universal mind consciously experiences all aspects of creation, both as objects of observation and as subjective states. There is no absolute difference between subject and object, observer and the observed, experiencer and the experienced, creator and creation. All the roles in the cosmic drama have ultimately one protagonist, and that is absolute consciousness itself." So here he emphasizes this idea that creation is not just the material world, it's also this realm in which our subjective mind or psyche is contained. And in the esoteric teachings, this subjective vehicle by which consciousness moves into its occupation and its participation in material reality, that this vehicle has an existence that is metaphysical. But the idea here is that all of this, the subjective and the objective, and the physical and the metaphysical, and the body and the psyche, that these are creations of this one spiritual reality, and that this dichotomy between the two only exists insofar as this creative activity is being fashioned by the cosmic consciousness. And also, it implies that at the culmination of this cycle of meditation, or this experiential adventure in consciousness, as Groff says, at the culmination of this, these dichotomies between subject and object become dissolved and merge. And so there's only this unity of being. And this idea that the unity of being is the supreme reality. Now, on the next page, I have some quotes that are going to be exploring and contrasting with the ideas that we were just talking about, the worldview of scientific materialism and the spiritual disenchantment that secular science has fallen into, and a sort of nihilistic worldview in which meaning and purpose is taken out of our understanding of reality. First, I have a quote from Manly Hall that kind of sets the stage. He says that acceptance of the physical world is the supreme ignorance. This is the basic illusion, the illusion that our lives were intended to be devoted to the achievement of material success. From this basic illusion are suspended practically all others. But this illusion is the thing that makes the meditation possible. So it's the aspect of unity moving itself into this self-imposed experience of individuality, of many separate individual things. And part of that requires particularly the human kingdom to undergo this experience in which it has the potential to become awakened to its true source and its true spiritual underpinnings in this unity of spirit realm, this unity of conscious realm, but it also has the potential to accept the illusion of materiality. And that's what we're in right now. We're in this phase of this divine drama in which we are locked in this illusion, in this supreme ignorance in which we accept material reality as the only existence. So in a way, scientific materialism is the apex of this creative act that results in individual split units accepting their own individuality as the ultimate truth and accepting the bodily self, the material world, as the ultimate realm of reality. Now, I have another quote here. This one's from Jung, in which we're going to unpack the consequences of this disenchanted materialistic worldview, the psychological consequences in particular. He writes, I have frequently seen people become neurotic when they content themselves with inadequate or wrong answers to the questions of life. They seek position, marriage, reputation, outward success, or money, and remain unhappy and neurotic even when they have attained what they were seeking. Such people are usually confined to too narrow a spiritual horizon. Their life has not sufficient content or meaning. For modern materialism, here Stan Grof gives this description of the basic worldview of this paradigm. He says, Western science portrays the universe as an impersonal and largely inanimate mechanical system, a supermachine that created itself and is governed by mechanical natural laws. In this context, life, consciousness, and intelligence are seen as more or less accidental products of matter. And I'm going to be going a little bit more into unpacking the worldview of scientific materialism here in a moment by going further into Groff's analysis of this paradigm. But briefly, I want to contrast it with the ancient holism perspective. So, according to ancient philosophy, the world is an intelligibly ordered, patterned, and coherently interconnected system, with humanity as an integral part of the whole. In this view, human life is not the result of random forces, ruled by capricious chance, but instead follows an intelligible trajectory, governed by archetypal influences existing in a dimension of reality that cannot be detected using the techniques of modern science. Now, going further into this paradigm of scientific materialism, I again have two quotes of Stan Grof's that I want to share. He writes, "According to Western mainstream academic science, only matter really exists. The history of the universe is the history of developing matter. Life, consciousness, and intelligence are more or less accidental and insignificant epiphenomena of development. They appeared on the scene after billions of years of evolution of passive and inert matter in a trivially small part of an immense universe. It is obvious that in a universe of this kind, there is no place for spirituality." And going deeper, he writes, "According to Western neuroscience, consciousness is a product of the physiological processes in the brain and thus critically dependent on the body. Very few people, including most scientists, realize that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is actually produced by the brain and that we do not have even a remote notion of how something like this could even possibly happen. In spite of this basic metaphysical assumption remains one of the leading myths of Western materialistic science and has had profound influence on our entire society." So the pathway of reasoning that we adopt in this current paradigm is bottom up, essentially. And with the idea that the more subtle aspects of reality, including mind and emotions and consciousness, they're things that arise bottom up, meaning the first thing that exists is the material object and the forces that govern material energy flows and the formation of objects and atoms and cells. And that out of the internal dynamics of these material systems, mind and consciousness arises. So as epiphenomena, meaning as chance byproducts, essentially. And this is, the exact opposite view of the ancient teachings. But nonetheless, even with all the pitfalls that actually science is confronted by in this paradigm and how it repeatedly doesn't actually explain the facts of nature and the facts of human experience that we do see in scientific testing, in scientific observation, and just in daily life in general, even though it fails to explain in any kind of satisfying way the reality that we actually live in and experience, that nonetheless it has become the dominant paradigm of our era. And people assume that it's true or believe that it's true with a kind of enthusiasm that imitates religious dogmatism, the religious dogmatism of past ages. And on this, I have a nice quote from Groff. He makes this point. He writes, "Many scientists use the conceptual framework of contemporary science in a way that resembles a fundamentalist religion more than it does science. They mistake it for a definitive description of reality and authoritatively implement it to censor and suppress all observations that challenge its basic assumptions." And that could not be more true than the situation that we see in the world today about what people conceive of as trusting the science, quote unquote, not understanding that what they're really doing is advocating for a type of, almost like a religious type of fervor for this certain paradigm of scientific materialism, that they're equating all of science with this one school of science, which is represented by this concept of scientific materialism. And it is a sort of a fundamentalist belief system that people will not drop even in the face of evidence. They'll just refuse to look at the evidence that goes against that set of assumptions. So it's a paradigm, it's an underlying set of assumptions and ideas that people adopt and internalize and build, systems of self-identity utilizing this paradigm. And it is very hard to have a paradigm like that die out in the hearts of the people who believe it with that type of religious zeal. Now, in this next section, I talk about some of the consequences, social and psychological, of this paradigm of materialism. Here, I quote Groff, who writes, "The authority that materialistic science enjoys in modern society has made atheism the most influential ideology in the industrial world." And then Richard Tarnas, in his book Cosmo and Psyches, elaborates on this point. He writes that scientific materialism has eliminated any enduring ground of transcendent values, spiritual, moral, aesthetic. The resulting vacuum has empowered the reductive values of the market and the mass media to colonize the collective human imagination and drain it of all depth. I really like the way he describes the consequences here of materialism. That in a disenchanted or a disensouled universe, that the powers of the market take over essentially, and everything becomes financialized, and everything becomes the object of scientific manipulation and the generation of technology to manipulate it, but there's no ethical standards or moral standards to halt any of this. So everything begins to run on the logic of this type of capitalistic nihilism. And so, continuing with Tarnus's take on this, he writes, when the mind becomes disenchanted, the world is logically seen in predominantly utilitarian ways, and the utilitarian mindset begins to shape all human motivation at the collective level. The drive to achieve ever greater financial profit, political power, and technological prowess becomes the dominant impulse moving individuals and societies. So these values begin to supersede all other aspirations that are not quantifiable on the level of science or capitalism. So everything is financialized. And again, the no other more subtle or beautiful human values are given the space to have their influence felt. They can be monopolized and controlled by these reductive values of the marketplace. So again, with Tarnus, he writes, in such a context, everything can be appropriated. Nothing is immune. Majestic vistas of nature, great works of art, revered music, eloquent language, the beauty of the human body, distant lands and cultures, extraordinary moments of history, the arousal of deep human emotion, all become advertising tools to manipulate consumer response. For quite literally, in a disenchanted cosmos, nothing is sacred. The spiritual dimension of the empirical universe has been entirely negated, and with it, any publicly affirmable encompassing ground for moral wisdom and restraint. In a world where the subject is experienced as living in, above and against a world of objects, other peoples and cultures are more readily perceived as simply other objects, inferior in value to oneself, to ignore and exploit for one's own purposes, as are forms of life, biosystems, and the planet as a whole. Moreover, the underlying anxiety and disorientation that pervade modern societies in the face of a meaningless cosmos create both a collective psychic numbness and a desperate spiritual hunger, leading to an addictive, insatiable craving for ever more material goods to fill the inner emptiness. And this produces a manic techno-consumerism that cannibalizes the planet. Now, how accurate is that? Everything is commodified, like I was saying. Everything is put a price on. It's financialized. And then science comes in with no moral backbone and just becomes the instrument of this process. And so the scientist, what we call the scientist, is really the person who is willing to use certain scientific techniques to build solutions that arise from the marketplace, from the demands of the flow of capital, rather than any other type of motivation. So the scientist is somebody whose worldview, this materialistic paradigm, this worldview, is one that is sort of self-selected by this dominant ruling class of financial elite, I guess you could say. Because the way the money flows, according to the system that financial elite has designed, is one that rewards the activities that scientific materialism produces. Ones that are oriented towards servicing the needs of this financial class, this financial sector. And all other values and all other concepts and all other ultimate alternative ways of using science and designing solutions, designing technologies, designing societies, and all of that is displaced in lieu of this one type of focus, this monoculture of thinking. Now, the question is why And is there a purpose or a larger meaning to why we've fallen into this situation, this state of affairs? And I want to quote Richard Tarnas and his work in which he summarizes and analyzes the work of Hegel, because I think he comes to the right concept here. And basically what he's going to be saying in this upcoming quote is that this era that we're in is part of a larger cycle in which this divine creator, the divine being, is undergoing its own growth process. And it's working out its own salvation, in which it is gradually experiences all the shortcomings of having adopted this enchantment with materialism and with individuality that's happening on a cosmic sense, and is taking place through the actions and birth pains of mankind, and that ultimately its own awakening and its own ability to transcend these self-imposed limitations that it has enacted on itself will come through an awakening of mankind. Meaning, like we were saying earlier, that mankind is a special vehicle in nature with which this awakening process can happen, but through which also this process of ignorance can be expressed. So there's a certain aspect of the divine consciousness that's in creation that is taking place within mankind, that mankind is the particular vehicle for certain impulses of the divine consciousness to be acted out. And so this fall into materialism coincides with the divine consciousness itself having fallen into a certain aspect of its meditation in which it has accepted the illusion of materiality and individuality. And its acceptance of that, it manifests within its meditation as mankind going through this stage. So we're this particular instrument of this great meditation that's happening. So on that note, Richard Tarnas writes, modern civilization's infatuation with the materialistic mindset and with its accompanying abandonment of religion reflects the dominance of a powerful archetypal gestalt, an experiential template that selectively filters and shapes human awareness in such a manner that reality is perceived to be opaque, literal, objective, and alien. This paradigm both expresses and ratifies a state of consciousness in which experience of the unitive and numinous depths of reality have been systematically extinguished, leaving the world disenchanted and the human ego isolated. This entire trajectory into alienation taken by the modern mind has not simply been an error, an unfortunate human aberration, a mere manifestation of human blindness, but has rather reflected a much deeper archetypal process impelled by forces beyond the merely human. In this view, the powerful contraction of vision experienced by the modern mind has itself been an authentic expression of nature's unfolding, a process enacted through the growingly autonomous human intellect, now reaching a highly critical stage of transfiguration, a necessary stage in the evolution of the human mind. I have one more quote from Manly Hall I want to read, and this has to do with the way that the human body is treated in the ancient philosophical teachings, in which the body is not the originator of action, but is the receptacle of action, meaning action originates with the spirit or with the consciousness. It flows through these physical dimensions of the soul or of the psyche, and then culminates in the body, which is the receptacle of these energies. So it's the exact opposite of what we think in sort of genetic determinism and scientific materialism, this idea that things originate with the material world and the mind and the consciousness arise out of the material body and the dynamics of this material system. That instead it's the exact opposite. It's that the material system is like an antenna. It's the receiver of these energies which originate with the spirit and flow down through the soul. So Manly Hall writes, quote, "The ancients declare that the human body was merely a vehicle of manifestation, a receptacle into which was poured the streams of power which descended from the mysterious subjective life of the individual. And so, it is never fair nor honest nor right to think of a person merely in terms of the body." Now, there's a few more points I want to make regarding this dichotomy between the paradigm that we have and the paradigm that we need to move into. And one of the concepts that we need to consider is the idea of evil. Why does evil exist in the world? If we live in a spiritual reality, where does evil come from? I write to explain this. In the thinking of esoteric philosophy, there is no concept of Satan or the existence of purely evil dimension to the universe. Rather, mankind creates its own evils out of its own immaturity. When we fall prey to our own worst instincts, we become our own Satan. More specifically, there are three great evils that inflict mankind: ignorance, superstition, and fear. In this perspective, evil is a phase that mankind falls into as it learns to integrate, develop, and express its own divinity. Now, building on this idea, Stan Grof points out that evil arises as a necessary consequence of the creative act. If the reality is unity of being, the move into a creative act in which individuality is accepted by this unified consciousness means it willingly undergoes a type of ignorance or an acceptance of illusion. And so this acceptance of illusion and move from the universal into the individual, the experience of the individual, partitions the consciousness of the deity so that its awareness of its own unity is masked in a dreamlike experience of itself as a matrix of separate individualized life forms. So inherent to that is a type of ignorance that it adopts. And this adoption of ignorance, when you combine this with this idea of karma, that causes have effect, an ignorant action will result in an effect. And in mass, when this happens, that is the origin of evil, is that the summation of a compounding cycle of ignorant actions ends up manifesting in this complex interplay of evil and ignorant actions that we see manifested all over the world. So that ignorance and the evil actions that men do are consequences, are things that breed consequence, but they are themselves, the fact that we're in the position is itself a consequence of a dynamic in which the consciousness that created us has accepted and adopted a type of ignorance in association with its move into this creative act. This creative act could not happen without this partitioning taking place within its own consciousness. But this all sets the stage for this grand realization to take place in which we realize the karmic implications of our own behavior and actions, and that we, one by one, undergo the experience of righting the ship. But on this basic idea, Grof writes that evil and its various manifestations is symbolic of the energy that makes the split off units of consciousness feel separate from each other. It alienates them from their cosmic source, the undifferentiated absolute consciousness. It thus prevents them from the realization of their essential identity with this source, and also their basic unity with each other. But since the divine play, the cosmic drama, is unimaginable without individual protagonists, i.e. without these distinct and separate entities, the existence of evil is absolutely essential to the creation of the world as we know it. And remember, evil and ignorance are synonymous here. We should remember that this creative motion from unity to diversity and back is an intentional act. As Grof writes, the creative intention behind the divine play is to call into being experiential realities that offer the best opportunities for adventures in consciousness. And then I write, it is part of the dharma, meaning the law, of our human existence that the task of freeing ourselves from the illusion of materiality and separateness should be challenging. Grof writes, quote, the ways to reunion with the divine source are fraught with many hardships, risks, and challenges. But the divine play is not completely a closed system. It offers its protagonists the possibility to discover the true nature of creation, including their own cosmic status. And here he's pointing out why things like mysticism and enlightenment and the esoteric disciplines of philosophy, why those things exist. They exist because there's a gateway in which the divine consciousness can awaken itself within the human being. And so what enlightenment is, and I'm saying this from personal experience, I mean, I'm just saying that this is how you make sense of it. Why does it exist and why is it taught in all these different cultures that it exists. And the idea is that it exists, or when it takes place, it is an experience of the universal awakening itself within the individual. That's what happens. That's what the quality of the experience is. That's why these spiritual mysteries exist, because they are components of this greater cosmic play that's happening. So these ideas then give us a concept of evolution, a non-Darwinian concept of evolution. And this non-Darwinian concept of evolution, we're understanding not just the fact that the physical form evolves, but that there's also this soul entity that's evolving. And the soul entity is the vehicle of the spirit, or the vehicle of the consciousness. So the evolution of the soul is tracking the long-term motions and growth pattern of this cosmic meditation that's taking place. And as the soul evolves, the body, the physical form that is the vehicle of the soul, evolves in order to become a better instrument, a more well-tuned instrument, so that the soul can express itself through that vehicle. So Manly Hall writes on this note that life is a continuous process of self-improvement in order to create an instrument capable of receiving the enlightenment of reality. Little by little, we tune in to the realities we seek by continually refining our own organism. This refinement of ourselves is the religion or philosophic life. It is the life of dedication and principle. So the ultimate aims of alchemy and the great spiritual practices that we've inherited from the ancient world are all techniques for how to do this. And Carl Jung's concept of individuation is a sort of modernization of this spiritual path in which you're learning to become a receptive instrument of the self, the universal self, and you're fine-tuning the body and the ego's governance of this individual physical system and its participation in the social and natural worlds, that all of this is taking place within this larger concept of spiritual evolution, of soul evolution. Now, there's one more thing I want to emphasize here before I wrap things up, and that is to consider the concept of death and rebirth, which is something that we explored a lot in the video or the episode on astrology. But for me, part of this idea of embracing and re-ensouling a new concept of the universe, a new myth, is to embrace reincarnation. And reincarnation is all about death and rebirth. So it's about that on the physical dimension, but it's also about that in terms of our own acceptances of illusion, that we have to, in a sense, die to our acceptances of the ignorances involved in this world of physical forms and individual beings. And we have to die to our identification with that lower self in order that we can become reborn as instruments and self-aware beings who are in tune with the higher self. So on this note that Manly Hall writes, disintegration breaks up patterns, releasing life from the forms in which it is imprisoned. The universe tears down only to rebuild. Disintegration takes place that reintegration upon a higher level can follow. And again, this is the essence of evolution adapted to this larger spiritual concept that we're now working with. And then one other quote from Hall, he writes, the end of all this searching is that the individual shall truly be able to be still and know God. And to bring this into a contemporary setting, and to looking at this idea of a death rebirth ritual taking place within our civilization and within our global society, which is what in many ways I see what's happening today as being a representation of that. On that note, Richard Harness writes, the 20th centuries, and now you could say the 21st, massive and radical breakdown of so many structures, cultural, philosophical, scientific, religious, moral, artistic, social, economic, political, ecological, all this suggests the necessary deconstruction prior to a new birth. And for more on that, check out some of my previous episodes, particularly the ones on astrology. So on the very last page of this publication, I have a quote. This is one that I've read before on the channel, but I'm going to read it again. And it's called The Role of Suffering in the Universal Plan, or that's what the theme of this quote is. Again, it's from Manly Hall from his book, The Road to Inner Light. And I do a little bit of paraphrasing here. So this is the quote, and this is going to wrap things up. One simple thing that everyone can capitalize on is experience. Experience is a very wonderful guide to man's conduct, but only if the individual interprets it correctly. To interpret it correctly, we must know more than most do know, and therefore, in all these areas, there has to be a certain amount of study and a certain amount of reflection. We have to gradually increase our insight and skill. There is a very simple, natural way by which the universe governs these things. One thing that nature has always provided is consequences. Actions always result in something, and we must finally come to the conclusion that an action which always causes trouble is not a good action. The moment we place this simple censorship of results, of consequences upon ourselves, meaning the moment we consider the fact that our actions have consequences and that displeasing consequences are things that are not what we want, that there's a purpose and a meaning behind it, there's a symbolism to it. The moment we realize this, then we have a strong friend in our own experience, meaning that the goods and bads, we can take all of them with a sense of gratitude that they have something to teach us, and they're not here to punish us, but they are here to instruct us to evolve. Ultimately, all harmfulness must end. And all harmfulness will end for the simple reason that the law of nature says that all harmfulness must harm itself. And that which is harmful hurts itself. And that which hurts itself increasingly can destroy itself. Harmfulness will not destroy good. It will only destroy harmfulness. But in the process, it causes a great deal of pain to those who are not sufficiently enlightened to understand it. The world has to be as it is until it deserves to be something better. And if it were not for this world, about which we are so unhappy, the person of insight would likely never have attained this insight. For it is this problem of the inevitable need of insight which creates the misery around us. And it is this inevitability that we can no longer live with the thing as it is that must ultimately force us into the search for the thing as it should be. We are all, according to our light and our means, moving toward this better state. And we can either follow the lengthy course of evolution, which, by birth and rebirth, karma, trial and error, will probably bring us all there in the next 10 or 15 years, or we can use the philosophical arts to perfect nature. The alchemist was an artist who anticipated the needs of nature and obeyed. We all have this potential in us. By anticipating the perfection that nature desires for us, we can advance more rapidly toward it, and in this way save ourselves a great deal of pain and sorrow. And this is an important point, and the last point I'm going to be making here is that there are disciplines of realization. There are disciplines of how the human laws work, the laws of spiritual and soul evolution and the evolution of the body. There are laws that govern how these things are meant to operate. And that the great ignorance comes when we don't obey this law. And that's where karma comes in. That's where cause and effect comes in. Because an action or an attitude or a behavior or a thought that is not in alignment with law will breed, by nature of the fact that it's departed from law, will breed a consequence. And the great illustrative example of this is the sustainability issue. That there's a law to the way that the flows of nature must move. The resource flows, the energy flows, the water flows. And that when we come in and we gum up that system and we create blockages and we abuse that system and don't obey the laws, then that creates consequences in the forms of ecological disaster and pollution and the consequences that those things have on us. And so the idea that there are laws that must be obeyed, and the role and purpose of philosophy in relation to religion and science is really about the discipline, following and understanding those disciplines by which we can reorient ourselves so that we become in tune with the law. And when you become in tune with the law, then the energy flows freely and the consciousness flows as it should into you. The spiritual energy, the spiritual light flows in and awakens and enlightens the individual. So that's what the philosophy of yoga was originally about. It was about following certain disciplines of the mind and body in order to clear out the blockages that obscure the flow of this energy. So it's about learning the law and obeying the law, essentially. And that is the lesson that we must take away. And that's the lesson that we have to adopt in our new paradigm of science that we're going to have to move into. And the essence of that is also going to have to inform our concept of religion. And that the religion is about the personal experience of the divine. And that can only happen when you obey the law. And this is not just about the law of scripture. This is about the law of nature. This is why religion needs science, to inform us about the laws of nature. And we need religion to inspire and capture the transcendent truths that we encounter when we have experiences of the divine. Because again, the religion is about the subjective personal experience of the divine. And the religious myths and allegories are meant to inform us about these archetypal motifs that are involved with these states of conscious experience. But in order to have those states, we need to have mastery of the psyche and the emotions and the body and all these things that science can help us do. So that's what the purpose of science is. Yoga is a type of scientific discipline. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from practice and trial and error through thousands of years. And so it's something that has been refined through a process that imitates the scientific technique, or what we call science. So that's what science is meant to do, is meant to clear the blockages that allow the true religion to come through. So that's it for this video, and that's the last chapter in this publication. I do have one follow-up video in which I'm going to be doing a breakdown of a Manly Hall lecture called I Beg to Differ with the Darwinian Theory, and that theme of that lecture is all about taking aim at scientific materialism, or this idea of secular science, and making a lot of some of the points that I was making in today's video. But you're going to hear it right from Mr. Hall, and he goes on into some other factors which are important. So that lecture analysis is going to be coming up soon. But to everybody who listened throughout this whole series, thank you very much. To all the people who have purchased copies, thank you very much. These will still be available, physical and digital, on my store. So anyway, that's it for today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Again, thank you for following the channel, and God bless.